in the unusual year that it's been since we've shifted to this way of doing programs. I think those of you who are joining us tonight are coming from more places, more distant places from the Seattle that a few of us here are in, and even the Bay Area that Chenxing Han, who is the occasion for tonight, is in. And we welcome you all, whatever day or time zone you're in. And we think you're going to be quite enjoy what's in store, which is this is apparently the second time and the first one outside of her kind of home base in the Bay Area that Chenxing Han will be doing a conversation about her just published and already the book that's already going into people's hands, Be the Refuge, Raising the Voices of Asian American Buddhists, which North Atlantic, our friends there, excellent publisher, have just published. And she's being joined by our friend and neighbor, where Sharon A teaches and is a professor of theology and religious studies at Seattle University, which is blocks away from Elliott Bay Book Company. And although the teaching right now, I think for Sharon is largely from where she is now, a basement in West Seattle, which is also my neighborhood. So we're neighbors that way. But the proximity, but also the distance, and that's part of what's at hand. And so tonight, Chenxing will to read and then converse with Sharon about this book, which she has done this remarkable piece of writing, and it seems surprising given once you see some of what she presents here is it should have been an obvious subject, but it has not really on this scale and range been raised about the place of Buddhism and who is practicing and adhering to aspects of it, and especially the range of Buddhist traditions and disciplines and practices that she does. Chenxing is this is a first book, and she has done this. She has actually has lived all over the place growing up, but has been for some years mostly based in the Bay Area, although she's also recently lived in Thailand. But she's got schooled in the Bay Area and got her MA in Buddhist Studies at the Graduate Theological Union there, and has been writing on this subject, but this is the first book. And her writings have also appeared in such places as Buddha Dharma, Lion's Roar, Journal of Global Buddhism, and Tricycle, among others. So publications that I suspect many of those here know of and read. And she studied in her studies have carried her a study for the chaplaincy at the Institute for Buddhist Studies. And that work has carried her on into the world, including working in spiritual care at an Oakland community hospital. So there's the practice part, but there's also the part she's done with this book. And I think the range here, which includes generations of practice, and I mean, she does several things here that I think haven't been done, certainly in one book. And in Sharon, she's going to have a great conversation partner. And Sharon herself, we were talking beforehand, because her own book came out not too long, I think in 2019, and then everything started getting crazy last year. But she is herself, she's the author of 3 books, but most recently, probably the most the kind of least scholarly of the books, but although she's got scholarship in her through and through in a good way, Occupy This Body, a Buddhist Memoir, which is a remarkable book. And I think Chenxing could actually wave it. I don't have it in front of me, but we will do a program with Sharon. We've got that worked out, which will get scheduled, but that we look forward to. But she has also done a lot of teaching and work and research in other aspects of Buddhist work and in yoga. She's done a lot of teaching and work in the community and in various kind of mindfulness, but also physical well-being practices, and really about broadening and deepening some of these things which sometimes stay in rarefied places and not so much in the community. And she's doing vital work. And I will say that I think between them, they're both, there's a lot about, a lot of people have this perception of Buddhism in the United States, and going by what you see in books And in magazines and publications, you think it's, mostly white people, and it's not. And to which Chenxing's, it's not just Asian Americans either, but Chenxing really gives some good substance to so many of the people who are practicing and doing this work in many aspects and from different traditions. So that's enough of that. I will disappear shortly and turn this over to them, but you are welcome to put questions in the Q&A little icon, or if it goes to the chat, that's fine also. And Sharon will pick those up at the point of the when she's kind of worked some of her questions in, but we'll work yours in. So please put those in. It's been great seeing all the greetings along the way. And also Karen, my colleague, has put links to the books, to not only Chenxing's Be the Refuge, but also Sharon's Occupy This Body. So with that, we thank you all again for joining us, and thank our speakers here tonight, and I'll ask you to please join in giving your good courtesy and attention to Chenxing Han and Sharon Su. Thank you both.
Thank you so much, Rick, for that
Thank you.
introduction. Yeah, thank you, Rick. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everyone at Elliott Bay Books. It's such an honor to be here virtually together. Sharon, thank you so much for joining me. It's really a pleasure. I think we maybe last saw each other when we met, I think more than 6 years ago at the AAAS in San Francisco, I think.
Yeah, it's a while ago. And look what happened.
Yeah, I know. Wow. And of course, thank you so much to friends and everyone in the audience. It's really wonderful to have you here. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Really appreciate you joining us. Looking forward to the future when we can really see everyone's faces and be in the same room together. So I think before we dive in, we were thinking it might be nice for me to just read a little passage of the book. I know some people here have read the book already or gotten the book or are getting their book soon, and the book is on its way. I know some people here, I saw Brian as in the participants from the IMCW Asian American Study Group. Some people were at the official book launch at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, and where for that event, I read a little bit from part one, and I thought I'd read actually still a little bit from part one. I know a lot of people from the BCA, the Buddhist Churches of America community, are here with us tonight. Also from, I think, perhaps Honpa Honganji, Hawaii are here. So part one of the book is really focused on the experiences of what I call multi-generational Buddhists, especially like Yonsei, Gosei, fourth and fifth generation Japanese American Buddhists. And we'll talk a little bit later, I think, about the way the book is structured. But this section I wanted to read comes just after I talk about how I came to first know about Shin Buddhism and was really a little bit alarmed because it's so part and parcel of the fabric of the history of American Buddhism. But this tradition is one that I think is too often erased. So the title of chapter one is Erasure. And I'll start from this section. When someone asks, "Are you religious?" or "What religion are you?" how do you usually respond? If you identify as Buddhist, how do you respond to the question, "What kind of Buddhist are you?" The Shin Buddhists I interviewed didn't always have straightforward responses to my questions about their religious identity. I usually don't say Jodo Shinshu because I don't think that most people know what that is, replies Kyla. I'm not Zen Buddhist, which is probably the main sect that Americans know about, responds Kay. Back in her native Japan, Kumi tells me, Shin Buddhism is like air. It's there all the time for me. But even before coming to study at IBS, she had heard that Jodo Shinshu wasn't well known in the United States. Her sect's obscurity in America took some getting used to. What do you think are the best known types of Buddhism and or Buddhist organizations in America? None of my interviewees, Shin Buddhist and otherwise, answered Jodo Shinshu or the BCA. David thinks the reason might have something to do with his tradition's failure to live up to Oriental monk expectations. I think when Americans think of Buddhists or Buddhism, they think of Zen or Tibetan Buddhism, probably because these two are the ones that come up the most in popular culture. The Dalai Lama is probably the most famous living Buddhist figure in the world right now, so there has been a lot of coverage on his particular sect of Buddhism. Zen seems to have gotten a lot of press as well when Japanese Buddhism is depicted in TV and movies. I want to say that the American idea of Buddhism is focused more on the monastic sects of Buddhism, the mysterious and mystical East, and their ancient knowledge. Like Kumi, Nora is the first woman in her family to become a Shin Buddhist minister. It feels fitting to interview these two pioneers in the same classroom at IBS, albeit 8 months apart. Nora's religious and cultural identities are very much intertwined. She feels bad about equating Shin Buddhism with Japanese culture, however, since doing so might unfairly exclude the many non-Japanese American ministers and members in the BCA. Of course, Shin Buddhism did originate with Japan, Nora muses. Her comment sparks a thought, and I go off script from my interview protocol. Since Zen also originated in Japan, do you think of Japanese Americans when you think of Zen? Nora looks startled. I don't, she frowns. I don't think of Japanese Americans, I think of Caucasians. When I think of Zen Buddhists, I think of the people pictured here. Nora is pointing to a photo collage of 20 faces that we discussed earlier in the interview. 19 of the faces appear to be white. One person appears to be of South Asian heritage. Credit for this provocative montage goes to, you guessed it, the Angry Asian Buddhist. And this is a blogger that I've mentioned earlier in the book. In a 2012 blog post titled, Why is the Under 35 Project So White? Arun writes, this year, Shambhala Sunspace has been posting weekly essays from the Under 35 Project, a laudable initiative to support and highlight the voices of the emerging generation of Buddhists and meditators. As usual, my naivety never fails to let me down, and I was once again shocked at the whiteness of the lineup. Not a single East or Southeast Asian among them. I wanted to skip ahead just briefly to close to the end of the chapter. For David, Shin Buddhism is a religion for the everyday person, but as a tradition with non-celibate, non-vegetarian priests, a tradition in which sincerely reciting the Nembutsu and listening to the Dharma is far more important than striving for enlightened states through seated meditation, Jodo Shinshu fails to conform to popular expectations of Buddhism. As David puts it, when people think of Buddhism, they think of vegetarian pacifist monks. So when they see a normal meat-eating American Buddhist like me, it kind of clashes with that idea. Through the figure of the non-sexual, solitary Oriental monk, Asian religiosity and spirituality are made palatable, psychologically, socially, and politically for dominant culture consumption, Jane Uemura argues in her book, Virtual Orientalism. The BCA doesn't seem to pass the taste test. But who gets to judge what's unpalatable? Who gets to decide the acceptable norm in American Buddhism? I do not want to see all Asian American Buddhists represented as bald monks who airbend, Kyla insists. I would like to see Asian American Buddhists represented as we are, diverse. And then if you'll indulge me, there's just one paragraph I want to read from the next chapter, Belonging, so that we're not solely in this space of talking about erasure or invisibility. So chapter 2 is titled Belonging. My conversations with young adult Shin Buddhists revealed a fount of fond memories. Making arts and crafts with kids their age at Sunday school after listening to that week's Dharma talk with their parents, clasping their onenju or juzu in gassho, colorful prayer beads looped between pressed palms as they chanted the Nembutsu. Watching their elders oshoko at the obutsudan or naijin until offering a pinch of incense and bowing at their temple or home altars became second nature. Dancing at Obon under the summer sun with 3 generations of family members, learning about the festival's origins and the Japanese Buddhist custom of honoring ancestors who have passed away. Visiting the Mother Temple in Kyoto on BCA-sponsored youth group trips to Japan. But these snapshots risk a static portrait. For all these commonalities, the religious journeys of young adult Shin Buddhists, and indeed Asian American Buddhists in general, are anything but homogeneous. Their spiritual paths are ever unfurling, often in unpredictable directions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Chenxing. It's such a beautiful book. And, you know, I was just laughing when you were reading passages about the kind of automatic association people make between Zen Buddhism and white practitioners. And I'm laughing because I just this afternoon went on to a Zoom webinar with a Zen Buddhist teacher, and there were probably about 80 people on there, and I kept scrolling through, and the majority of people were white. So, you know, the percentages are actually the same that, you know, you were just reflecting in your own book. So these issues about whiteness and the construction of American Buddhism and erasure are so prevalent. And I love that you started with the Shin tradition, and you know, Seattle has the Seattle Betsuine, and I know Marissa's in the audience, and to all of our friends at the Betsuine, just a big shout out for hello, because it makes such a difference. And the tendency for Asian Americans to be considered some kind of watered down version of a more authentic thing that gets coded as white is something that I see very much in your book. And the first thing I want to say is just thank you for writing this incredible book. It's something that we really need. And I see in many ways this book is a kind of, it's, how shall I put it? It's very prophetic, and it ties together and weaves together so much in ways that are compelling. And ultimately, we want to read this book, you know, because there's parts of you in there, and there's parts of your community, and you're also creating community with this book. So I think it's not just about, you know, what are various Asian American Buddhists experiencing and what are their concerned. It's also this very generative text, because I think what you're pushing for, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a community and an acknowledgement of a community that's been here all along and that continues to grow. And so I'm really grateful for your work. I also absolutely love your affection for Arun that comes through in the book. And it's exciting because it weaves together the personal, it weaves together your interview material, it weaves together scholarly sources, and you create this book that is intimate, it is groundbreaking, intellectually savvy, and accessible. And the combination of those things, I think, is a very difficult thing to pull off, and you do it really, really well. So I have so many questions, but I won't ask them all because I want to make space for audience questions. So the first one is, you know, very helpful for, I believe, the audience, which is that I know you've gotten this question a lot, but if you can share with us and help situate our listeners who might not actually know, but what inspired you to write this book?
Sure. I mean, I sometimes feel like all books have like multiple origin stories in a way. And in a way, I think this book, if we were to speak in Buddhist terms, was like a profound coming together of different causes and conditions. It was partly my own loneliness / confusion / curiosity of thinking, where are all the young adult Asian American Buddhists, right? I'm reading in the Pew Forum that 2/3 of American Buddhists are of Asian heritage, but then I'm going to these primarily white temples, or I'm going to temples where it's primarily immigrant Asians, and it seems like no one between the ages of 5 or 50 are there. So I'm thinking, are we out there? And it would have been incredible to do something more intergenerational, but I thought if I spoke to other young adults, then I could do something really more pan-Asian and pan-Buddhist. And I think Asian Americans are always racialized in this way where like we're getting all these different ethnicities lumped together in sometimes like very uncomfortable and strange ways. So we're just constantly being talked about. And I just really wanted to know, like, what does it look like to center Asian American Buddhist voices? And as you mentioned, Arun, the angry Asian Buddhist blogger, was a huge inspiration. He was blogging back in 2009 about these issues of race and representation. And he got me thinking, like, yeah, like, what is it with these Buddhist magazines where it's constantly just Buddha statues or like white svelte yogis and yoginis on their covers? It sort of seem like, I write in the book, like I felt like I kept missing the obvious. But once I thought of the topic, I thought I just really need to start interviewing people. And things kind of snowballed from there.
Yeah, it's there's so much in here that in many ways, and this was one of my questions for you as well, you talk about a kind of pan-Asian American Buddhism. And so my question really has to do with this vexing, troublesome issue of the two Buddhisms that, so sort of white convert Buddhism and the other stuff, right? The Asian American stuff. And it seems like it's just a dualistic separation, but there's always a value judgment there where the Asian American practices are not seen as being authentic enough because there's not enough meditators. And so what I wanted to know from your perspective, first of all, is do you see that is there an Asian American Buddhism, first of all, and how would you kind of explain that? And secondly, a lot of the people that are on this webinar and the people that you write about and the scholarly sources, we're all picking apart the two Buddhisms model all the time, right? And yet it still exists.
Right.
So what's beyond the two Buddhisms model?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think there's a use to a limit with this two Buddhisms model. I mean, there's some truth to it, but I guess writing this book, I sort of almost, once I just started listening to people and interviewees, it almost shifted from the sort of intellectually, there are a lot of limitations. What about our Black, Latinx, mixed race, et cetera, Buddhist friends? Where are they fitting? Where are Asian American converts fitting? I mean, this model is such that I would find, like, in part 3 of this book, which primarily focuses on people like myself who weren't raised Buddhist, so convert Buddhists, like convert is almost in scare quotes almost the entire time, and it's because people felt that category had been so racialized as white and like in a way that really erased culture and erased histories. So there was a sort of trying to reclaim what it meant to be Asian. And so I think this sort of relates to the first part of your question, is there an Asian American Buddhism? I think in an America that racializes people from various Asian heritages as Asian American, it's sort of inevitable. And I guess the book is kind of a playing with this category. Like I'm really interested in like the possibilities and the limitations. So I'm not so much like, people sometimes think it's a work of sociology, and I have to say again and again, like it's really not. Like it's really a collection of conversations. There's no existing statistical database of Asian Americans where I could have randomly chosen people. So it kind of emerged through these different themes. And I think that some of these themes will resonate with some Asian American Buddhists, some of them won't. And I'm also like very interested in the kinds of dissonances or the disagreement, or I think it was really good for me to meet these people and realize like, oh yeah, I don't actually agree with all my interviewees, or like, I don't even to say get along with all of them. I'm sure some of them like were really annoyed with me by the end of a very long interview. They're like, are you done? Are you done with these long questions? But actually, I think that in and of itself is really important. I think it almost brings a kind of Buddhist perspective to these identity categories where they are interdependent and interconnected, but also very much impermanent and not like this reified thing. So I was just really impressed by the kinds of depth and thoughtfulness and honestly the generosity of people to kind of like think with me about these issues.
Yeah, you've gotten in your interviews, it's amazing the information and the perspectives that you're able to elicit. And some of the things I love so much really are about the anger. I'm so glad that you are talking about and highlighting anger, because there's this way in which Asian American Buddhists are seen in media and pop culture as just these kind of docile, passive people. And if we look at the cover, I'm just so intrigued by the fire on your book cover. So I just have the older version. I haven't gotten to the book
Gallery
yet.
copy. You have one of the earliest copies.
I know this is, it's going to be something I can sell on eBay for a lot of money as the original, but
$1,008 to make an auspicious Buddhist memory.
all right. Can you talk about the fire and talk about your cover? And does it relate to anger?
Yeah, that's a great question. A big thanks to Jeff Morphew at North Atlantic Books. So for the cover, actually, it's sort of like we were talking before this call about mood boards, right? I kind of thought, I think I'd like something. I have terrible graphic design skills. So I thought I'd like something that's simple but bold. And I was just saying, like, looking at these Buddhist books, I'm like, please no lotuses, please no clouds, please no Buddha statues. I don't want anything that's like very East Asian or a specific Asian sect. I don't want something that's like very specifically one sect of Buddhism. And I thought, thrown some ideas around, like maybe hand mudras, maybe, so I didn't think of fire necessarily, but I did send, I remember, a picture of the angry Asian Buddhist. Aaron loved to design. He was really good at it. And so he had made like his website, Angry Asian Buddhist, speaking of like anger and Asian, right? Like that in and of itself was like designed to get people to stop and think like, wait, what is this about like the model minority Asian American? Like it just blew people's minds because Buddhists aren't allowed to be angry. Asian Americans aren't allowed to be angry. And so he, I think, actually used a lot of like red and yellow and orange in that. So I think I got to pick from a few different designs. And actually, when I first saw this design, I was like, oh, that's too bold, which is really interesting that was my first reaction. And then I was like, it took me a while. And then I thought like, oh, actually, this is perfect. And I was actually, when that design came out, I was writing the anger chapter and writing about fire. And so like in a way, the cover design actually inspired or just perfectly dovetailed with precisely where I was kind of finishing up the last chapters of the book. And I guess I would also say, I wrote a lot of this book while living in Southeast Asia, and there are beautiful Buddha statues there in temples, in the museums. I remember we used to live like around the corner from the National Museum in Phnom Penh, and there are these beautiful Black Buddha statues. So I feel like I guess I don't see Buddhist art very much in general in the US. So for me, like, I don't know, the color of the hand also just feels very fitting. And probably what touched me most is a friend of mine who looked at this cover. She's not Buddhist, although she feels an affinity with the religion. And she just said, when I look at this cover, I feel it shows me who I could be or who I want to be.
That's powerful. Yeah. Thank you for that. So one of the things, as I mentioned earlier, that I love about your book is that it has a kind of Asian American, I think of as a prophetic voice. I'm always looking for our voice, like who's the person out there kicking ass, right? And I feel that this book does that and elevates the various ways that Asian Americans have practiced Buddhism all along, and with this integrity. And that being said, there's parts of the book where you reference both your own sort of authenticity anxiety as like, well, if you're in a predominantly white Buddhist Sangha, you don't quite feel right. And then when you're in an Asian American temple, you don't quite feel right because the language acquisition is an issue. And so this question of like, well, where do we belong? And I laughed so hard because that was me too.
Yeah.
Right? So I have that authenticity anxiety as well. So I want to know if you could speak to this in terms of your interviewees and how they reflect upon their own struggles as Buddhists.
Yeah, I mean, it is, as you said, I think that particularly for second generation Asian American Buddhists whose parents might have grown up primarily in Asia, where they got to experience what it felt like to be likely the ethnic majority and even sometimes the religious majority, and where Buddhism is just like woven into the fabric of their life in a way that it can't when it's such a minority religion here in America. So it sort of felt like, oh, the elders know how to attend to the home altar or know the rituals or know the language or know how to bow correctly to the monk, that kind of thing. So I think inevitably, there's anxiety there, right? That one of my Tibetan interviewees, spoke really beautifully about being worried about like bumbling the prayers or feeling always a little bit anxious in the presence of the different geshes and the different lamas, and that being a process to have, one needs to work through. And then at the same time, I think it's like doubly dispiriting or oppressive when then there's also this like Christian lens imposed on people, Christian assumptions, like how often to measure your level of religiosity, or kind of a white Buddhist sort of, I call it the meditation resume check, like how much have you meditated? How much do you meditate? As if that is the only form that Buddhist practice takes. Like to me, it's like as if offering fruit at the altar doesn't matter, or chants don't matter, and they very much do. But I think when people look and see it's primarily white Buddhist teachers and white Buddhist scholars speaking for American Buddhism, there's just a insecurity. And I think one of my interviews, Tiffany put it so beautifully. She said, it's not a right, but a risk for many Asian American Buddhists to speak up, because they often face backlash or harassment, or, worse, we see the vandalization of Buddhist temples in Southern California, just a few months ago. Yeah. So yes, that I'm, and it's funny, right? Because writing about this sort of authenticity anxiety, I think I kind of hoped, especially for other Asian American Buddhists, just for them to understand, like, I'm not alone in feeling this way, and to also hopefully like reclaim some of the forms of knowledge that they do know, just that aren't celebrated by the dominant culture or valued by the dominant culture in the same way.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just as a follow-up, I was struck also by your interviewees who seem to express this kind of internalized racism as well, in terms of how they're understanding what it means to be Buddhist and encountering Buddhism through whiteness. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I feel like that theme really was particularly strong in like part 3 with convert Buddhists. I think I think especially right now we see like insight and mindfulness meditation being so broad. And, I'm glad that these practices, are of solace to people, are of help to people. But I think for a lot of Asian Americans, there can be certainly some confusion in those spaces. I mean, everything from just where's the cultural element, or where's the Asian historical element, or to hearing in these spaces people say, Buddhism was brought to America by white converts in the 60s and 70s through Zen, which is just blatantly not false, and like 100 plus years behind. But when these sorts of microaggressions, you could call them, when these sorts of things happen, and then there's teachers who still have a certain degree of authority, it's very difficult to challenge them. When white Buddhist teachers are making fun of Korean lay members, saying, oh, they're just shucking peas, that's not real Buddhism. I think that it becomes really difficult for Asian Americans to feel a sense of spiritual home or belonging, when on the one hand, they may be very drawn to these practices and these teachings, or respect these teachers. But on the other hand, it's very hard to challenge and say, like, actually, that's not true. I remember, I'm saying they, but this is also myself, right? 10 plus years ago, starting out in inside spaces, hearing these kinds of things and being too scared to speak up, right? Or not feeling safe enough to speak up. That's unfortunately part of the reality. And I guess, I'd say even, to an extent, it's like, as hard as I tried to center Asian American Buddhist voices, and to a large degree, this version succeeded much better than the first draft of this book, which is much more academic and kept centering two Buddhisms, which meant actually that it kept centering primarily white male scholars. So I think that I've succeeded in a large part, but there's always this limit, I think, because American publishing is very predominantly white. And so there's always like this awareness of that kind of white gaze. And I've been thinking about that with some people who've been sending me emails back and forth, talking about like, we were talking with someone about like how important and powerful it would be to see like a book focused on LGBTQIA voices of Asian American Buddhists. But then, this gets into like within some Asian temples, there's also patriarchy or homophobia or racism. And what I find really hard about like writing about those issues is like, yes, but it's so hard when it seems like the dominant culture is all too eager to just take Asian American Buddhists and make them this kind of retrograde foil, so that they're just like this superstitious backwards Buddhist, as if patriarchy and homophobia and racism don't exist in the dominant culture. But it's almost hard to write about this like in a more honest way in my own book, because I'm sort of afraid of those words being twisted, or like used against us, or just being like, oh yeah, that belongs in those little ethnic enclave, these bad things that American Buddhism is so free from, so I don't know, I've been thinking about those dynamics of how do you center quote unquote minority voices when the majority, especially, not in numbers, but in who has the power to publish and review, are still predominantly white.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we definitely see in the academic world, as you know very well, and we see it all the time. And there was a question I was going to ask, but I completely forgot because I was so excited by what you were talking about. So we're just assume that was just pandemic brain. I was so excited to ask the question, I completely forgot what it was. But this takes us back to, I'm really interested in this idea of an Asian American Buddhism. And you were talking about anxiety, or the lack of language, right? And knowing the language is so pivotal for understanding, the depths of perhaps one's parents' or grandparents' tradition. So if we're in this process, and I'd like to think that we are, of building a kind of Asian American Buddhist movement, if you will, does it move beyond language? And is it enough to have English?
Oh, I don't think it's enough. I mean, I think that when we build this movement, people have language. I mean, even if it's little bits and pieces, I don't know.
But this is where the authenticity anxiety comes through, right? Because many Asian Americans are not fluent.
Right. But I don't know. I guess I would say, I mean, yes, it may be that, our lingua franca is English. And actually, that's kind of amazing too. Like if we had stayed in our respective countries, obviously many people in those countries learn English and, because it's a global language. But I mean, here in America, we're like in the same space and we're being racialized in the same way. So we're almost like given things in common, even if we didn't necessarily want the things we were given. But I think Buddhism is also powerful when you have Pali or Sanskrit or Tibetan, or you have sacred languages. And there's something about, I think a lot about chanting and people chanting together and how it's possible. We don't just have to chant in English. We can chant in languages we don't know. I mean, like we can sing in languages we don't know.
I actually hate chanting in English.
Right. Yeah, I mean, my husband's right with you. He's always like chanting in Vietnamese and he's white, But yeah, I mean, I think chanting is such a powerful practice. Like when I imagine, I guess I'd like to hope that Asian American Buddhism is like a really big, to borrow Reverend Tanaka's words, like a really big tent where we can have a chance to speak in our mother or father tongues, or as my aunt calls it, my half mother tongue, my quarter mother tongue. And rather than, I don't know, feeling insecure, which I totally get, like this kind of shame, and Ratama, a Cambodian American, this book talks about that, like my broken Khmer, like I feel so much shame around it. But I think there's a way in which just having any little bit, like it's in your bones, it's in your memories, it's in the memories of the lullabies that were sung to you, that is a powerful connection to Buddhism as well. And there's a way in which, I think like one of the most painful things to witness about American Buddhism, like the way it's presented in the mainstream, is how it's so stripped of the incredible like linguistic diversity of Buddhism across the world. Like there's an instance in the book where one of my South Asian interviewees was so frustrated because they're like, yeah, so they put Japanese in the chant book, but they put it upside down. Like, what does that mean, right? Like,
Yeah, that was something in the book when I read that. I had a big eye roll there, because I can see it happening.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the things that struck me a lot in your book as well, and you talk about this for your own experience, and I certainly know I've had this experience as well, about how difficult it can be, or how challenging it can be, to want to claim this Buddhist identity because you feel like you don't quite fit it. And yet there's so many white Buddhists that have no problem identifying first and foremost as a Buddhist, and then you have many Asian Americans that, and ones that I know too, and if they are Buddhists, they just don't ever talk about it. And so, can you talk a little bit about your sort of your view about this?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like my view is like, there's no one right way to be a Buddhist, right? And I
It's very Buddhist of you.
it's very Buddhist. No, but I mean, I guess, but I feel like I started this book thinking there was one right way to be a Buddhist, like, and it had to do with meditation
Ah,
retreats, and
okay.
it had to do with like being able to speak for the tradition. And then I interviewed all these people, and I think it was actually that process that gave me a kind of permission. So, in other words, I'm not necessarily saying all Asian American Buddhists should like stand up and, like, it's not everyone is comfortable. And I think Holly in the book really speaks to this very well, because she's sort of like, how do I, make space for our voices when I don't want to like replicate the dominant culture, when I don't want to participate in a kind of cultural arrogance? And so, I don't know, I think what a lot of people in the book really beautifully illustrate is like, I think someone, that was it. I feel like I gave him like 3 pseudonyms, so I'm not gonna say his name in case I get it wrong, but he was saying something along the lines of like, skepticism is a healthy part of being religious, or grappling with things is a healthy part. But I think what's really hard is like, unfortunately, that doesn't sell, right? Like sound bites sell, and like strong, bold claims sell, but like nuance, grappling, questioning, like there's a lot of questioning in this book. There's a lot of like wanting to question with other people. And so part of me feels like, I don't know how you can change a whole system to make it, rather than making like declarative, this is Buddhism, or this is the way it should be, or in this
Mhm.
sort of like aggressively like dominant way. How do you like step back and make room for like, is this Buddhism? Like, what do we mean when we say authentic American Buddhism? What are the questions that are important to us? Like, I think part of that impulse that I really admire among a lot of my interviewees, the reason they don't want to speak up is they know they don't speak for everyone. I mean, maybe everyone should know they don't speak for everyone, right? I feel like, and it makes me think of our movements of this time, or Black Lives Matter, where it's in some ways leaderless, or you could say also leaderful. So I think in a way, my interviewees, many of us are trying to figure out, how do we be like leaderless as a movement, yet also leaderful?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's very exciting to think in those terms, which gets me to my next question, which is, where do you see Be the Refuge fitting in with discussions about racial justice and injustice that are at the forefront of our nation's consciousness today?
Yeah, that's a really hard question, actually. I feel like that is an ongoing question that I'm still trying to answer. I mean, what's really interesting is that I did the interviews themselves before Black Lives Matter really took off. So there's a few mentions of it in the book, but it's not, primarily central. And I think it would be really interesting if someone did a project, of interviewing Gen Z Buddhists. I think that we would learn a lot from there, because this book is maybe a little bit more focused on millennial Buddhists. But certainly, I hope the book can be part of these conversations. Duncan Williams and I were just talking about this, about how when we talk about race only in like sort of a white-black binary, there's so much that's missed. And I guess something else I've been thinking about is, I have sometimes heard from people like, Asian Americans should step back to allow other BIPOC voices. The Asian American Buddhists, should step back to allow other BIPOC voices to step forward. And I understand like the impulse, where that's coming from, the kind of urgency of the Black Lives Matter movement and the disparities in this country. And at the same time, I always feel like I want to push back against some of the assumptions that go into that statement, which is to say, like, this assumption of fragmentation. Like, I have people who are saying, like, I'm mixed race, Asian and Black. Like, what am I supposed to choose? But like, I'm Buddhist. Like, am I supposed to choose between this? Like, it doesn't make sense for me in a multiracial future. Is half of me supposed to step back, half of me supposed to step forward, right? But also, I think the assumption that there's some kind of like zero-sum game. There's like only like we're all fighting for such a small piece of like the attention pie or the media pie or whatever it is. So I guess like I'm really interested in, I hope the book is kind of an opening, a challenge, to like, I mean, it's called Be the Refuge for a reason, right? Like, what are the ways we can be a refuge for ourselves, but for our broader communities? How can we build community and build coalition? And I think that looks like really understanding like our own our own and other like cultures and races. It doesn't look like stepping back, fading into the background, which I think can be a pretty harmful message, especially for Asian Americans who are really kind of already told to step back and fade into the background. I think it's too easy. I mean, that's just not doing any of the work.
Mhm.
Whereas I think there's a way we can all step forward together in solidarity with others.
Yeah, and I honestly think that your book is such a wonderful opportunity. It's a catalyzing kind of book
Mm.
and generative. And so it's not just a critique of the two Buddhisms model, which is so tiresome. And yet I myself still hold on to my frustration and anger with it, which means I still perpetuate it. The
Mm.
more angry we are about it, the more we allow it to take up way more attention in our minds than it probably should.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. I think Gia Tolentino calls it like extending the half-life of, well, I think she said assholes in the particular context she was talking about, but extending the half-life of maybe bad ideas or just tired ideas. I'm
Yeah.
totally with you. I would love for us to be able to, yeah, really move beyond that.
Yeah, yeah. It's I'm with you. I would be happy to have some time to just sit back and talk about other ways of talking about
Yeah.
Buddhism in this country. So I wanted to ask you before we move into audience questions. You know, your book is brand new, just came out. Um, is there anything in particular about its reception that surprised you so far?
Yeah, wow. Oh gosh. I think because the journey to getting published was so difficult and I was getting messages like, there's not really an audience for this book. Like, I mean, I think we were just talking about this, before the call too, but I was kind of interested in like writing an anti-celebrity book. Like, I'm not a celebrity. No one who knows. I'm just a layperson. And I guess I've been really, really deeply touched by the letters that have come in, people who actually aren't interested in the two Buddhisms at all, but are saying, I don't know, I feel like they're refracting the book back to me, like the emotions that went into writing this, like the tears, but also the joy or the sense of relief. Getting those messages, I guess it's a reminder because it was such a long journey. And I think sometimes people think like, I read the book, it's done. Okay, next. And actually, I feel like the book is now doing its own thing. I hope connecting people. And I've been really, really moved by, yeah, by the kind of, it may not be like in quantity, like reaching tons of people, but it feels like people find it really meaningful. There's a depth of meaning there. And I guess I would say like by the end of writing this book, was thinking like, writing this book, I hope is kind of an act of chaplaincy. It's an act of spiritual
Mhm.
care. And for Asian American Buddhists, but I also hope for, Buddhists more broadly, for American Buddhism more broadly. And perhaps what's surprising me now is I'm being chaplained by the responses to the book. I'm being cared for and heard.
Mhm. Oh, that's beautiful. Wow. Um, I can see this book being something that many young Buddhists at all the Buddhist temples that we had, the Asian American Buddhist temples, all the Shin Buddhists out there, and the really strong young Buddhist associations. Marissa, I know you're in the audience. That this is a book that should be discussed in the temples themselves. I think it's a really affirming book. Apologies for my dog barking in the background. All right. Is there any last thing before we move into questions from the audience? Any last thing you just want your audience members to know about your book that we haven't covered?
Um, just gosh, if you feel moved, write to me. And, I love hearing from you all or share this with your friends. Disagree with me, tell me what I'm missing. There's so many. I hope this book can be a resource and inspiration. I hope it opens more conversations. I hope it is definitely not I hope it's one in a long string of books to come on this topic.
Great. All right, so let me open this up to some audience questions here. So this one's not a question, but it's a comment from Kimberly. Thank you for talking about centering Asian American Buddhist voices, ! Yes, it is important to not be erased and made invisible. I'm a third generation Asian American Buddhist, and your commentary speaks to my personal experiences. It's so powerful to actually read a book that resonates with your own experience. I think in and of itself that there's such, that resonance is really deep. Next question, what do you think would arise if you have spoken with Shinryu Suzuki or Trungpa regarding your book?
Whoa, that's a great question. Wow. Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I would have to give that some thought. I wonder, right? Because we're not like contemporaries I'd have to get in a time machine. I mean, it makes me think of I guess one thing that where my mind goes to, I mean, I'm sorry if this is not directly answering the question, but I just remember asking my interviewees about like, who do you think are famous American Buddhists? And usually people would say the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh at first. And I'd say, well, what about like Buddhists living in America? So like not just famous to Americans, but like famous in America. And they'd have this long list. And then I'd ask like, so can you name a famous Asian American Buddhist? And there would just be like stunned silence. People just couldn't think of anyone. And one of my interviewees said, yeah, the only ones I can think of are in Asia or dead. And among the dead people that did come up were Shunryu Suzuki Roshi and Chogyam Trungpa Roshi. Right? And I think it's really interesting. I think people would want, I think some of my interviewees would want to ask them, why did you choose, why did you ultimately choose to primarily serve white Buddhist audiences, right? Rather than like Asian immigrant audiences. Shunryu Suzuki came for Japanese Americans, but then went a different direction. I mean, I would be fascinated, to learn more about that. And in a way, their imprint on what Buddhism means to Americans is so powerful. And yet one could say they're somewhat, whether intentionally or not. I mean, I think Buddhism is a missionizing religion. It's open to people of all faiths. So it's totally understandable that they would want to like spread it widely and perhaps beyond Japanese Americans, beyond Tibetan Americans. I mean, it's also maybe was just a matter of financial, like who can support you financially in this country. This is such a great question. Thank you. I'll have to ponder it more, but that's what comes to mind. Wow.
Yeah. That it's I think that the drawing a blank when being asked is who the Asian American Buddhists are, the kind of trailblazers, if you will, the prophetic voices. I think that pause is so important for us, not to try to answer away, but just to kind of hold that, because it's a question I always have too. And who are our people?
Yeah.
Right. So you do have a lot more questions coming, so I'm just going to keep going here. It seems that white Westerners have tried to exotify and colonize Buddhism, as has been done to jazz and rock and roll music. What are ways to decolonize American Buddhism? What might a post-colonial American Buddhism look like?
That's a powerful question. I don't know if I'm fully equipped to answer that question. I think that this question relates to a question I feel like has been coming up a lot, I think, around cultural appropriation, around what do we mean by colonialism, and it gets into a lot of tricky territory, I think, in terms of, and I guess I would say, like, what does it mean? I don't know, I feel like I'm a little bit copping out and perhaps disappointing the person who answered this question, but I feel like the most honest answer is like, I don't know. And I think there are a lot of people asking this question, places like at the East Bay Meditation Center. Part of what my book is getting at is something around a more intersectional Buddhism, around a Buddhism that's thinking about issues of race and sexuality and gender and history. Right. What do we mean when we say colonial? And that obviously means something very different when we talk about actual colonial histories and when we talk about it here on, as we sit on lands that are ancestrally and, unceded territories. Yeah, I don't know. I'm curious, Sharon, actually, what thoughts that you have on this question from your work and your thinking on this topic.
Oh, goodness. I'm still struggling with whether I want to be in this conversation with dominant, the dominant Buddhist culture, because it's exhausting.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily change the game, right? And I see this in the academy all the time. There's a lot more emphasis now on writing about, for example, decolonizing Buddhism, where divesting from these possessive investments in whiteness and Buddhism. And I see that coming in terms of books that have been written, but that's the academic world.
Yeah.
And the academic world, however much we want to think that it changes things, I don't really see the change in many of the predominantly white Buddhist communities that we have. And also the same thing with the academy. We'll do something on race and it's a one-off, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, they did their job. We talked about race. Good job. Carry on. So for me, I tend to have more of I think I gave this talk once where I called myself a Asian American Buddhist killjoy, because I just was tired of the fight to constantly be heard. And I thought, well, there's a way in which maybe these conversations are more generative when we have them together and on our own first, to develop that kind of critical mass, because the ubiquity of whiteness and the investment in whiteness is so profound in the Buddhist community, that communities, I should say, that I'll be honest, I'm at a point in my life where, you're a nicer person than I am, I think. I personally need just to step away, from having these conversations all the time. And even in the world of publishing, it's like, oh, sorry, an Asian American anthology is not important enough, it's just enough already, right?
Yeah.
So if that's the case, now let's make it ourselves.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of interviewees who, we have to build our own platforms. I've struggled to find a podcast where I can be interviewed by a non-white person. the kinds of that affects the reception of the book. Speaking of decolonial, but that's really hard. I do think a lot of this, obviously this book, I think, was built on spiritual friendship. And that means I don't know. And I think it's always important to separate what do we mean by whiteness and white people, helpful not to attack entire groups of people of any race. I think it's important to remember that Asian Americans, are multi-ethnic, multiracial. Aaron himself was half white. So I think that, I don't know, to me, it's sort of like building that critical mass also looks like figuring out what the shared values and shared intentions and shared goals are, and then trying to build a wide enough tent where, we're not all going to get along, we're not all going to agree, but how can we still stay together in some kind of spiritual friendship? How can we still really try to be Buddhist family, or try to be, family committed to a cause?
Yeah, you are a nicer person than I am. Oh, good. I appreciate that. So I'll move on to another question. How do the topics you're writing about come up or interact with Buddhisms and Buddhist practices outside the coastal area? So Midwest, South, etc., or perhaps in Canada?
Yeah, I think that I've talked about this before. I was based in California when doing these interviews. The 26 interviews were in Bay Area in Southern California. And then when I opened it to email interviews, I got people from kind of all over, including people who'd lived in Canada. But of course, many of us are often on the move. So I think that people were shaped by being in the Midwest, being in the South. I don't know, I feel like this is a question for readers, what would a book that focuses just on Asian American Buddhists in the Midwest or in the South, what would that look like? I think it would look different than this book, but also have similarities. So I think for me, I was hoping if I present some of these broad ideas, people can tell me what, resonates, and then also maybe what doesn't feel like it resonates based on there's like this tension, right, between the regionalized or the local, but also like the universal, or I shouldn't say universal, but in a globalized world, there's going to be things that resonate across. And I think it's also really important just to acknowledge Hawaii. I think that might have been a question that people have. I did this research for this book with like pretty much no funding. Like I wasn't, I was just interviewing people. It would be great to see a book come out of Hawaii, because I think I'm thinking about the BCA, there's like 60 plus temples in the continental US, but Hopa Honganji has like 30 plus temples. I mean, and this is a multiracial, multi-ethnic. I'm thinking of the 2012 Pew Forum, right, which neglected to interview Hawaiians completely, and therefore came up with the idea that Buddhism in America is majority white. So like there's like really a critical mass, actually, I think, of Asian American Buddhists in Hawaii, having of different sects, different traditions, like different backgrounds. My friend Christina Moon, who's a Zen priest there, has been, really is working with a group of people where we're trying to do an Asian Pacific American retreat for Buddhists, hopefully 2022 or in the year after, that brings together Asian American Buddhists of different backgrounds. And we're kind of dreaming of maybe having that in Hawaii, because the context is really quite different than the continental US. And I'd love to see more attention paid to that. I think that's definitely a limitation of my book.
Well, it's the next stage, right?
Yeah.
It's not a limitation. There's only so much an author can do. And it's your first book, which means the first begets the second, right? So not that you're probably not quite ready to sit down and write that book yet. Maybe you are. I don't know.
Well, maybe someone else can raise their hand and volunteer for that one. I would say you are a really nice person. Thank you.
Planting the seeds, right? Yes. So the Pew Forum, that was such a difficult, that Pew study on Asian American, the mosaic of faiths. Okay, the title in and of itself. Many of us who were external advisors for that study, when they came out with the title of Asian Americans: A Mosaic of Faith, all we could think about was like the melting pot. And I was like, really? But the issue with that study was that many of the questions trying to gauge Asian American religiosity were questions that were based on a kind of really heavy Christian normativity. Yeah. And so as external advisors, we had to go in and change all of the questions, because, many of the questions were like, how many Sundays a year do you go to temple? I'm like, that's not really, the questions are based in an entirely different religious tradition.
Right.
And so there was so many problems with just beginning to understand Asian American Buddhists, for example, because the questions were based, there was a question on like, do Buddhists celebrate Christmas? What do they think about Christmas?
I remember that one. It's
like, yeah, we all like to have presents under the tree, so why not? And it wasn't a big deal, but it was posed as this kind of problem.
Right.
I thought, well, many of us are probably a little selfish and we just like to give and get presents. So it's, So anyways, I'm glad that you highlight the Pew Forum questions in your book, because, it draws attention to the ways in which even asking the questions about how Asian American Buddhists practice their religion, you have to ask the right questions, to get the real answers, and not the watered down version of a tradition that's not their own. So thank you for that. I think we have time for another question here, I believe. Well, first of all, I'll start with thank you for asking my question about outside the coast, and thank you for bringing up Hawaii, which I left out. Bows and gratitude. And then, can you say more about what's meant by investing in whiteness in Buddhism, or Buddhism being colonized by whiteness?
Can I say more? I feel like I want to ask I myself don't tend to use the word colonize as much, but I'm really interested in learning more from people who do prefer to use that word, and for the specific, because I think it takes on different valences if we're talking about Native American traditions, if we're talking about the histories of Buddhism in Southeast Asia, right, for another thing. So I don't know, I feel like I need a little more context to that question to answer it well.
Yeah. Well, let me say what I meant. I'm the one that said possessive investments in whiteness, right? Which comes from George Lipsitz, and this idea that whiteness, we're possessively invested in whiteness, meaning that it accrues economic benefit, right? Social capital, etc. And so there's many white Buddhist communities that have been addressing issues of whiteness and white privilege. And it's great to talk about it and to feel bad about white privilege, but if you're not willing to do anything beyond that, like that's the possessive investment in it. It accrues benefit to you, to the person. So there's these conversations that are had because they're supposed to be had, much like in the academy. Oh, we're adding now a little section on race and Buddhism because we have to. But that's not the norm. That's the one-off, because the not, you don't really get a lot of money in academics, but the social capital, your investment in that is quite strong. So that's what I mean by it.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate you making that point very much. Yeah, I don't know. This makes me think like a recent review of the book kind of said like, this would be a great book for sanghas with affinity groups. And there was a part of me that just said like, no, like the point of the book is like, this is a book for like all of us like need to understand our cultural and racial positionality. Like, and it's not a moment, right? It's a movement. It's not like a thing that happens like I'm like Black History Month is great, but it's really like every day of our lives should be educating ourselves more about this like multiracial, multicultural, very complicated society that we live in. And so it's like really frustrating to me when books like this are just like put into this sort of ethnic enclave or like ghettoized into this sort of, okay, like, yeah, no, I mean, that's not relevant to me. Yeah, that's really frustrating.
Yeah, the affinity group, I see the value of it. I think it's incredibly important, and yet, because I'd rather be in the affinity group, quite frankly, than be the minority in the larger group, right? But at the same time, it might be my own hangup. It's like the same thing with the two Buddhisms model. I hate it, and yet I still use it. Right?
But I think for me, it's sort of, I guess we see some white affinity groups now as well, but I think there's a way in which it then becomes like all that work of like dismantling racism or doing the decolonization work, whatever you want to call it, just like falls onto the group. And it's sort of like, well, the dominant group, like they're already doing that. So like, I don't really have to concern myself so much. And I think that is really problematic, where I think actually in the collection Black and Buddhist, Pamela Ayo Yatunde does a beautiful job of like talking about like her experiences of especially like people of color groups and both like the limitations and her own frustrations, but also the importance of them and how to relate that, right, the affinity group with this broader movement building.
Right. I mean, I think I'm selfish because when I've gone on POC silent retreats and I love them, and there's affinity groups there, and I'm perfectly supportive of those affinity groups in that context, right? So there was often an LGBTQIA group that met during this retreat, which was this very safe container. And so for me, I thought, well, that's beautiful. Wouldn't it be nice if we had one for Asian Americans too? But so that to me, again, I'm selfish. I like that. But when it's the larger context of saying that your book would be really great for affinity groups, it means that it's not centered. It's not normative.
Right.
So that just makes me angry. All right. So let's see. I think there is a question about if you've spoken with, you've just mentioned Pamela Ayo Yatunde, Cheryl Giles, or any of the essayists featured in the book, Black and Buddhist. If so, how can Be the Refuge and Black and Buddhist complement each other?
Oh, that's a lovely question. Yeah, I mean, Lama Rod Owens is one of the blurbers of my book. And I hope they're complementary books. I think of them as such. And I think that it's, for me, it's been really inspiring to see a lot more Black Buddhist writers be writing books, writing essays, and just gain more visibility. I mean, as so often has happened in the US, the Black community has helped, I think, pave the way and helped put race and representation, these issues, front and center. And I mentioned Lamarada Owens, we have the same publisher. So there's that. I think there are a lot of affinities. And I just did a podcast interview with Ethan Nickturn that's up on his podcast, The Road Home. And it was kind of touching to see who he linked to when talking about my books, including Sharon A. Selassie. It's and reading her work, I feel like so much resonance, and partly it's just from an immigrant experience, and for her also, teachers like her, like Ruth King, many others, I think we're all kind of arguing like we need culture and race like cannot be separated out. It's like, this cultural baggage metaphor really doesn't work. I think like it's not something you can lose at the airport. Like it's like culture and race, it's just completely intertwined with our expressions of Buddhism, our understandings of Buddhism. And I think there are some people certainly who don't want to engage with these issues as much, but I think it's still really, really important to know like that there's a degree of privilege in getting to not care about these issues. And also, as Buddhists, if one is committed to reducing suffering, I think it's really important to know that there are people who have to think about these issues day in and day out. And so to build greater empathy, at the very least, to help reduce the suffering of those people, I think is really important.
Thank you. I know we're rounding to about 8:15. I could keep going having this conversation. So I guess, Rick, or if I need to wind it down, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just keep talking to Chenxing all night, happily.
Maybe one or two more questions or comments, and then because we can let some people go on into their night, though I'm in favor of doing this again like next week or something. So
amazing.
Marvelous. And but anyway, go ahead, carry on a little bit more, and then we should probably wind up for the night.
Great. Chenxing, do you have any questions that you want to just put out there?
Let's see, or can I don't know if we've answered all of the questions.
I feel like I've gotten to, feel free to put more questions in the Q&A.
I picked up a comment, I'm coming here audibly, in the chat, which Karen will post how to find this whole conversation again online, and we now save the chat because there's so much in there. But this is a particularly sweet comment to you, Chenxing. It's from Sawaria, and it goes, "I am so very happy to watch this panel. It is beautiful and encouraging. I can't wait to buy and read your book, Chenxing. I do apologize. I never responded to your request for an interview. I was so frightened with representing my community, especially with our campaign to save our temple, coupled with the traumas we are going through and put through. This talk is inspiring, energizing, and healing. I'm so sorry again for my fears and not interacting. I'm so glad for your success and voice."
Oh, thank you. That's so moving. Thank you. I mean, don't apologize, but oh wow, thank you for your work in helping preserve and fight for our Buddhist communities, our Asian American Buddhist communities. I'm so glad you're here. I think, speaking of which, I saw a question earlier. Someone asked, where was I living in Southeast Asia when I wrote the book? And I think I just want to acknowledge, living in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and then in Bangkok, Thailand. And I think there was something about being able to be part of a racial majority and being able to be part of a religious majority, something about just seeing the way Buddhism is practiced there. And I don't mean to romanticize it in any way, but it was a really powerful shift. I'd love to actually feel like there's not enough writing about Asian Americans living in Asia, because it's not like we fully fit in there. And my Khmer is terrible and my Thai is terrible. So I would pass for Thai, but then people would ask for directions, and then it was really embarrassing. But I don't know, there's something I think that's really powerful about this book having been written there. And I think the hybrid nature of this book was sort of made possible in part because I was able to step away from some of the really overwhelming or infuriating yeah, that what it feels like to be in America when it's so aggressively monolingual, or what it feels like just to be a double minority racially and religiously, like day in and day out. I have a lot of gratitude for my time in those places. And I also would love to see more from Southeast Asian Buddhists and people from South Asia too, I think have really powerful perspectives on Buddhism, some of which are woven into this book, and there's a lot more to learn.
I have one more question for you, and I'll try to get it out before my dog barks again. If you could choose one person to read your book, who would it be?
Oh my goodness.
Famous, like just in your mind. I would be so happy if this person read my book.
Can I say the Obamas? Because I remember one of my interviewees talking about how included they felt when Obama acknowledged Buddhists in a talk of theirs, when so often we hear about Christianity and Islam and Judaism and people don't talk about Buddhism. Yeah, that would be amazing.
That's a good answer. There is one more question. What advice, if any, would you give to Asian American Buddhists who live in communities that have no temple or have a predominantly white space?
Yeah, I mean, I guess part of what we're all learning from this pandemic Zoom age is there are, I think, some Asian American affinity groups out there to maybe connect with them. I think always to read, to try to find those people, to a certain degree, maybe after the pandemic's over, if it's possible to travel places, gather, meet in person. I know it's never quite the same when we have to do everything digitally, but it is definitely better than nothing. And yeah, I think for me, being a book lover, it's really powerful to read perspectives, not just by Asian American Buddhists, but I think especially by more marginalized Buddhists from different backgrounds. I think there's a way in which we can sort of imagine our communities on the page, and then there's a way in which that inspires us to build them in the person.
Thank you. Let's see. One more question. Chenxing, having lived and been exposed to both Buddhism as practiced in the States by Asian American or otherwise, and Buddhism as practiced in mainland Southeast Asia, what are some of the stark or interesting differences you notice, and what do you think caused those differences? How much role does the difference in languages play in shaping those differences?
Oh, that's a lot of questions. That's a beautiful question. Yeah, I mean, the histories are so different, right? The primary context is so different. Thinking about, again, like what it means to be a racial and religious majority. I mean, in ways that can even go in directions that feel frightening, right? When it turns into nationalisms, or when we think about Buddhist violence that's perpetuated against Muslims, for example, if they're the minority, that those are certainly, I mean, it's such a different context shift. I also, like, after I finished my year-long residency in hospital chaplaincy, I was really burned out. And I was in Taiwan first, actually, at a Buddhist college and monastery there. And something that for me was such a delight, actually, was that people's language was just Buddhism. And so it was like, we would mention like karma or affinities or yin yuan, or like, it was just a Buddhist worldview. And I just was not used to like just being plunked down like, oh, like no one's going to look at me askance if we're talking about past lives, or like how everyone's been my mother in a past life. This belief, like, it was so different. I mean, language is certainly a part of it. It was, right, we're using Chinese, and that language, it was sort of like, it made me realize how much English is, the ways we talk about religion is so shaped by Christianity. And so to go into another language where actually the language has been more shaped by Buddhism, that was a really powerful and unique experience. Like when you're in Southeast Asia, if I knew probably in Sanskrit and the language is better, I would see how those are also, it's sort of like Buddhist ideas are just woven into the culture. And, who knows, maybe in many centuries from now, many generations from now, America will be more like that. I mean, things are always changing. And I think also what surprised me is that there's also many global connections, right? I see mindfulness being popular and people are interested in it in like Taiwan, but they're not talking so much about the critiques that have been put against mindfulness. So that's also an interesting phenomenon of the ways that these global flows. And I also think Asian Buddhism affects American Buddhism, but we're often so like invested in a sort of American exceptionalism of what Buddhism is that we fail to see what those impacts can look like.
Okay. I think that that's the last question that we have in the Q&A that I can see. And yes, there's some wonderful comments in here. I'm just going to read one. This one is from Bright. A comment to share. I grew up in China when I was small. I didn't understand when my grandma prepared green bean as a cooking chore. She hand measured and cut the long beans into 2-inch pieces in precision, slowly and mindfully. Easily took her 30 minutes. This is the way she meditated. A moving meditation, the Chan in everyday life. She would look at Guanyin statues at home with calmness and respect. She never went to temple or formally meditated. Only after she passed away did I reflect and understand. She has much wisdom.
That is so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Let's see. Can't wait to hear the advance of discussions and ways of being Buddhist. I think you're opening up this opportunity for us to really engage this conversation without coming away with easy answers. So I love that you don't have a solution in your book, or really fixing a problem, because there really isn't a problem. But from Facebook, though, questions keep coming. What led you to Buddhism?
Oh my goodness. Well, I talk about this in the book, so I won't completely rehash it there, but many, many different circuitous, fortuitous causes and conditions, I think. But I really started exploring in a gap year after high school, where I was able to travel through Asia. And yeah, I grew up in an atheist household, sort of very suspicious of religion since my parents went through the Cultural Revolution. And then I was seeing beautiful, art, architecture, and just honestly the devotions of people. And I thought, there's got to be something to this religion. Actually, it made me want to learn more. And I think also, like many people, a good amount of suffering too, just psychological and emotional suffering on many levels, especially in high school, that I experienced. So all of these different strands, led me to it. And now it's sort of like so ingrained in my life, I can't really escape it, which I'm glad for.
Yeah, I think suffering is definitely the way in for a lot of people. And yeah, I had a question, but again, pandemic brain stole it. If there are any other questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A. Or, I see Rick now. So
I didn't know if you were. I thought you were about to say. If I thought you were about to segue into the closing it down your part. But if something else, there's Suari who had the comment that Chenxing responded to.
Just thank you so much to everyone in the audience. These are just such beautiful, thought-provoking questions and comments. It's really such a privilege and an honor to be here with all of you tonight.
Yeah, thank you for bringing these incredible stories to all of us. And I have such an incredible sense of mudita for you, this kind of real sympathetic, empathetic joy at your success with this book. And I'm really looking forward to, I'm going to use it in my own classes for sure, because it's a book that people will really connect to. And in my own interest in dismantling some of the, the authoritative texts that get propagated in these courses on Buddhism. So I'll be centering yours, and because it's important. And it's only by doing this that we tend to take away a lot of the attention from books that are great, but they probably have had too much attention at this point. So thank you for your work.
Thank you. I'm just so happy to know that these voices will be centered, and I'm happy for all of us, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let me say, well, the book is front and centered in our bookstore, and I think it will be for some time. I think what the book says so much, and this is just the beginning of its life that way. And I think it'll be one that continues. And the two of you, though, through this as a way of introducing this book to people, have both been wonderful. Sharon, your dog has been a good contributor too. Dogs are part of these. The other thing I'll say about how this has gone, I mean, it's so hard not to want to have this in a room together, and then people, if they want to, some group could go out afterwards to somewhere where you'd have a candlelit or low lit space and have whatever you might want to have to drink at this point, and kind of can carry on that way of sort of carrying it down. But one of the things I've noticed on this online, you two held quiet and silence in a way when it got quiet, and usually that doesn't, you think something's wrong online when that happens, and you two were able to have such moments. I think that also says something about the kind of focus and care that's here. So again, just thank you again both, and maybe we do want to do this again, but maybe we'll turn the tables over when we do something with Sharon for her book. Maybe we can get Chenxing to come back and turn the questions around a little bit. But for both of you, because you two are fun to watch together and good watch. So thank you all for wherever you are. You may well be in your day if you're to the west of us across the Pacific, as some of you are. At least one person, the person in China, had to go back. Had to leave. He wrote signing off. But anyway, thank you all for joining us wherever you are, and take care, be safe through all the things we're dealing with, and we will see you hopefully again soon in various ways. So thank you again for everyone. Thank you for my colleague Karen as well, who has really been, she's also part of carrying this book in the store and putting it in people's hands as well. So thank you again. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Great.